A snowstorm swallowed Pine Valley the night he fell, an old man lost in the forest, whispering not for rescue, but for four names the world had long forgotten. No one could have imagined what came next, because no one believed a dog could remember a promise made in silence. But some bonds don't break, they endure waiting patiently beneath the pines. Stay with us. What you're about to witness is a story of devotion, of loss, and a return that defied all understanding. In the highlands of Pine Valley, Colorado, winter came early and stayed long. By late October, snow already blanketed the evergreens, and the wind whistled like an old ghost, weaving through the creaking timber of forgotten cabins. The sky that morning was iron gray, and flakes began to fall steadily thick and deliberate. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility dropped with each gust of wind. The town of Glenwood, 20 miles downhill, was already shut in. At the very edge of a pine-covered ridge, there stood a modest weathered log cabin, a quiet sentinel amidst the storm. It belonged to Walter Bennett, a 73-year-old man with a frame still strong, though worn by time. He stood at 6 feet tall, lean and wiry, his skin etched with the kind of deep lines that spoke not only of age, but of stories too long to tell in one sitting. His white hair curled under the brim of his wool cap, and his beard was full but neat-tinged yellow at the edge of his mouth from years of pipe smoking. Walter had once been a high school English teacher in Denver, passionate about poetry and moral philosophy. But life had grown quieter since the death of his wife Elaine nearly 2 decades ago. Their son Thomas had moved to New York with his own family, leaving Walter with nothing but old books, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and the whispers of mountain wind. Walter was not unfriendly, merely solitary by nature, a man who had learned to make peace with silence. He kept a tidy cabin, chopped his own firewood, and spoke to the forest as though it were an old friend. He didn't fear the wilderness, he revered it. That morning, as the snowstorm intensified, Walter stepped out into the biting wind to gather more wood. The sky was a swirling mass of white, and the world had faded to shadow and snow. As he approached the tree line, he heard it faint, muffled, almost imagined at first, a whimper. He stopped and listened. Again. This time clearer, a high-pitched trembling sound, carried on the wind like a cry for help. Walter dropped his bundle of wood and followed the sound through the thickening snow. His boots crunched against the icy ground, and he shielded his eyes from the flurry with a gloved hand. After a few minutes of trudging, he spotted a small shape near a downed cedar log, no several shapes. 4 tiny golden retriever puppies huddled together, trembling violently. Their golden fur was caked with snow, their eyes wide and wet with fear. They were no more than 8 weeks old, barely weaned too young to survive on their own. One of them let out a tiny yelp when Walter knelt down. The first pup, with lighter fur and intelligent eyes, looked up at Walter without fear. He would later name this one Sunny, for the streak of warmth in his gaze even in that frozen hour. The second, a darker, scruffier pup, with a slightly torn ear, snarled weakly as if to protect the others. Walter would call him Rusty for his defiant flame-colored coat. The third, a dainty little female with a soft, cream-colored ribbon around her neck, was too weak to move, but held Walter's gaze. She would become Daisy. The fourth lay still, but breathing fur, pale and damp. Walter touched its side, and it stirred faintly. This one, graceful even in stillness, would be Maple. Walter looked around, but there was no sign of a mother, no tracks from a vehicle or human nearby. Just these 4 creatures abandoned in the wilderness. His heart, long accustomed to beating, quietly surged. "You poor things," he murmured, scooping them up into his arms and tucking them inside his heavy coat. "No storm's gonna take you today." The hike back to the cabin was slow and treacherous. Snow had risen past his knees, and the wind howled louder than before. By the time he reached the door, his beard was crusted with frost, and the pups whimpered against his chest. Inside, he laid them on a worn flannel blanket by the fire, stoked the embers to life, and heated a pot of warm milk. He worked carefully, rubbing their paws, drying their fur, feeding them drop by drop. Their small bodies twitched with life, a pulse of warmth against the storm that roared outside. Walter did not sleep that night. He watched over them like a guardian, whispering the names he had just given them, one by one. He recited old lines of Frost and Whitman as lullabies. Outside, the blizzard raged with primal fury. But inside that little cabin, something ancient and beautiful had been rekindled purpose. As the fire cast dancing light against the log walls, Walter sat back and exhaled. Well, he muttered half to himself, half to the tiny golden souls curled against one another. Looks like none of us are alone anymore. By late March, the grip of winter began to loosen. The snow that had once buried Pine Valley beneath a white silence now melted into soft earth, feeding streams and awakening the pine-scented woods. The world outside Walter Bennett's cabin, transformed what had been a monochrome wilderness, now shimmered with color. Pale green buds unfurled on branches, crocuses defiant and early bloomed along the path to the woodpile. In this quiet rebirth, something else had blossomed too: companionship. The four pups, Sunny, Rusty, Daisy, and Maple, had survived the winter with Walter's devoted care. Now they thrived. Sunny had grown into a sturdy, confident dog with a keen awareness of his surroundings. His light golden fur was thick and glossy, and he had developed a habit of scanning the woods from the porch like a sentinel. Rusty, wild-eyed and mischievous, was slightly leaner, but no less bold. His torn ear stood as a permanent badge of defiance. Daisy, always the gentle one, often curled at Walter's feet as he read by the fire. She had taken to carrying around small objects, a slipper, a pine cone, as if nesting. Maple remained the quiet observer, with her creamy fur and solemn eyes. She followed Walter closely, always watching, as though listening to thoughts he didn't speak aloud. Together, they formed a peculiar family, a retired teacher, and four golden shadows who never strayed far from his side. Walter talked to them as if they were his students. He read them, poetry, told them stories from his youth, even taught them small tricks with gentle patience. They responded with loyalty that ran deeper than training, rooted in the memory of being saved. One morning, as Walter and the dog strolled beyond the cabin, into the thawed clearing, they heard movement deeper in the trees. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to pass through deer, foxes, even the occasional bear in spring, but this sound was too deliberate. Emerging from behind a thicket was a woman in forest green, her boots caked with mud, and her auburn ponytail swinging beneath a cap marked with a badge. Jessica Moore stood at average height with a fit build from years navigating rough terrain. Her face, lightly freckled and sun-bronzed, bore an alertness shaped by long hours outdoors. Her eyes, sharp and ocean-colored, scanned the scene with curiosity and caution. She wore the uniform of the local forestry service and carried a notepad tucked into her vest pocket. Jessica had grown up in the nearby town of Glenwood, daughter of the late forest chief William Moore, a respected ranger who had died in a forest fire when she was 15. That loss had burned into her a sense of duty, and she'd followed her father's path into conservation, driven by both love for the land and a need to protect what remained. She had first noticed paw prints a few weeks earlier, 4 distinct sets too orderly to be wild. Today she followed the trail and found something she hadn't expected. Walter paused, gripping his walking stick. The dogs stood around him, tails low, ears up. "Can I help you?" Walter called, voice hoarse from the morning chill. Jessica offered a small smile. "I think I should be the one asking that. I've been tracking canine prints around here for days. Wasn't sure if I'd find a wild pack or some eccentric old myth." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Well, I suppose I'm both." Jessica stepped closer, crouching slightly to offer a hand to Daisy, who sniffed her glove before resting her chin on it. "These yours?" she asked, scanning the dogs. "They are now," Walter replied. "Found them during the winter, or rather, they found me." Jessica's gaze softened. Golden retrievers, purebred by the looks of it. Not something you expect in the middle of Pine Valley. Walter nodded. "No tags, no mother. Someone must have dumped them. They wouldn't have lasted a day without help." Jessica took mental note of the scene, the way the dogs hovered protectively near the man, the absence of chains or enclosures, and the clear health of the animals. It was unusual, but not alarming. "Well," she said, rising to her feet, "you've done good work here. These dogs trust you. That's no small thing." Walter shrugged, looking down at his unlikely companions. "They've kept me warmer than firewood." Jessica smiled genuinely this time. "I patrol this side of the ridge every few weeks. Mind if I drop by again? You're a bit of a mystery in town." Walter grunted. Mysteries deserve their solitude, but I suppose I could make coffee. They parted ways that day with something unsaid between them, a mutual respect perhaps, or the first stone in the bridge between two lonely lives. Later that week, back in Glenwood, Jessica mentioned the encounter to her supervisor, a grizzled man named Keith Dunlow, with graying sideburns and a permanent frown. Walter Bennett. Keith mused, stirring his coffee in the ranger station. "I remember him, retired teacher. Used to come into town once a season, buy groceries and vanish again. Nobody's heard from him in years." Jessica tapped her notepad. "He's not a threat, just isolated. And now raising 4 retrievers in the woods like some kind of forest monk. Keith shrugged. As long as he's not setting traps or letting the dogs roam, he's not our problem. Still, Jessica felt drawn to the old man's story. Over the next few weeks, she began visiting Walter occasionally, first with ranger business as an excuse, then with baked goods from her neighbor, and eventually with no excuse at all. Each visit revealed more layers. Walter's dry wit, his encyclopedic knowledge of literature, and the way he spoke to the dogs as though they were his lost students, all fascinated her. She learned that Rusty hated thunderstorms, that Daisy whined in her sleep, that Sonny once chased off a bobcat from the porch. In turn, Jessica began sharing pieces of her own life, her father's legacy, her guilt for not being able to save him, her restless search for meaning beyond fire lines and trail markers. And somewhere in the blossoming green of Pine Valley's spring, a quiet bond took root. Summer in Pine Valley was a brief but brilliant fire. The pines shimmered in waves of green under the high-altitude sun, and the mountain air buzzed with bees and hummingbirds. Wildflowers peppered the meadows, and the nearby creek danced freely over smooth stones, its icy waters fed by the last of the melting snow. The cabin stood firm at the edge of it all, a timeless outpost surrounded by life. Inside the cabin, things had changed too. Sonny now stood tall and muscular, his once puppy paws grown into powerful legs. His golden fur gleamed in the light, and his eyes held a depth that made Walter pause sometimes, as if the dog were pondering some old truth about the forest. Rusty had filled out his playful aggression, mellowed but never gone. He was the fastest of the 4, often sprinting ahead during their daily walks, tongue lolling out and ears flapping in the wind. Daisy had blossomed into a graceful, attentive presence. Though still tender in nature, she was now more observant, quick to notice Walter's mood changes and slow steps. Maple had become a quiet wanderer, often breaking from the group to explore small trails and then returning as if reporting on what she'd found. Walter watched them grow with a pride only a parent could understand. And yet, as the weeks passed, a quiet truth settled into his bones. They were not his to keep. He began to teach them slowly, gently, not with commands but with permission. He let them run farther ahead on the trails, hesitated before calling them back. He allowed them to roam the edge of the valley even when he couldn't see them. He taught them how to listen to the wind, to smell danger, to return not out of obedience but understanding. Not everything we love, he told them one dusk, as they lay beneath the stars, is meant to stay. And that's all right. During one of their walks, they passed the old fire tower, long abandoned its ladder, rusted and halfway overtaken by vines. Walter hadn't been up there in years, but Rusty circled it curiously, barking toward its base. From the brush emerged a young man with a sketch pad and camera slung across his chest. He wore hiking boots, dusty cargo pants, and a flannel shirt stained with charcoal. His name was Eli Grant, a 27-year-old wildlife illustrator from Boulder, with shaggy black hair, a soft stubble beard, and thoughtful gray eyes hidden behind thick-framed glasses. He raised both hands in peace. "Whoa, didn't mean to startle anyone." Walter narrowed his eyes. "You're on forestry land." "Got a permit," Eli replied, patting his vest pocket. "Documenting golden eagles for a project on rewilding zones. Been up here 2 weeks now. First time I've seen dogs." He knelt slightly to let Daisy sniff his fingers. "Yours." Walter didn't answer directly. "They're mine, for now." Eli smiled and offered Walter a cup of thermos coffee. They sat for a moment near the tower, the dogs lying down around them. "You live up here year-round?" Eli asked, scribbling something in his notebook. Walter gave a half shrug. "Retired. Found a quieter life among better company." Eli chuckled. "They seem like a pack that doesn't need taming." "They're not meant to be tamed," Walter replied. "I'm just helping them remember something they already know." Eli's expression turned reflective. "Wish more people thought that way. Most folks try to force nature to fit into their lives. You're letting it go." Walter stared toward the tree line. "It'll go anyway. The question is whether it remembers you kindly when it does." It was a strange moment, both heavy and calm, as if the forest too was listening. A few mornings later, Walter woke before sunrise. It was unusually quiet. No scratching at the door, no wagging tails or expectant eyes. He stepped outside, heart slow, but heavy. The meadow was still damp with dew, a soft mist curling above the grass. The food bowls were untouched. He called once. Then again, only the sound of birds. He followed the usual trail, hoping they'd just gone for an early sprint. but there were no paw prints in the softened mud, no movement in the trees. Walter stood at the edge of the ridge where the pine trees parted and offered a view of the distant hills. The sky was golden pink, warm and vast. Somewhere out there, 4 companions were running free. He let out a long breath, as if it had been waiting in him for months. There was no note, no signal, only a feeling. They were gone, not lost, just where they were meant to be. He returned to the cabin alone. The silence felt deeper than before. Not cruel, just hollow in the way a room feels after someone you love has left it. Later that afternoon, Jessica stopped by. She brought honey cornbread and wild mint tea, both wrapped in foil. She noticed the quiet immediately. "They're gone," Walter said, before she asked. Jessica sat down on the porch beside him. "All 4. He nodded. Didn't even say goodbye. She looked into the woods, then at Walter. "That's how you know they're ready." They didn't talk much after that, just sat and listened to the world around them. That night, Walter didn't cry. But he did reread a poem by Mary Oliver. Then he folded it, placed it inside an old box, and added 4 gold-colored name tags he had carved by hand: Sunny Rusty Daisy Maple. Autumn crept into Pine Valley with quiet dignity. The vibrant greens of summer gave way to a palette of rust gold and deep amber, as if the trees themselves were surrendering to the inevitable passage of time. The wind grew cooler, the nights longer, and the air carried the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. Walter Bennett's cabin stood the same as ever, nestled at the edge of the forest, though now its windows glowed with a softer light, and its occupant moved a little more slowly than before. Walter, now approaching 74, had begun to feel the weight of the seasons in his bones. His hands, once steady and strong, trembled slightly when holding his coffee mug in the morning. His walks had shortened to slow strolls around the cabin, aided by a carved oak cane gifted long ago by a former student. His breath came harder on colder days, and he'd taken to resting longer by the fire, staring into the flames, as though they held a story only he remembered. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his spirit, though weathered, refused to dim. The absence of the dogs, Sunny Rusty Daisy and Maple, had left a hollow space in his life, one that silence now filled. He didn't speak aloud as often anymore, but every so often he would catch his own reflection in the window and mutter, "They'll be back when they're ready." It was both hope and farewell, folded into one quiet sentence. Jessica Moore visited more frequently now. She came every Friday like clockwork, even when her schedule grew tight or the trail was muddy. She always brought something: homemade stew in a thermos, a new book for Walter, a bundle of dry pine kindling. She had changed too. Her posture was less rigid and her voice more open when she sat across from him. Gone was the guarded edge of a woman burdened by her past. In its place was someone softened by companionship, by shared silence and the exchange of small stories. One afternoon, as golden leaves fell in swirling spirals, Walter asked, "What made you keep coming back?" Jessica leaned back on the porch bench, stretching her legs. At first it was curiosity, then concern. Now, she paused. "Now I think I just like who I am when I'm up here." Walter chuckled low and warm. "That's the forest's trick. It shows you who you are without all the noise." Jessica looked out toward the ridge where the dogs had last been seen. "People in town are starting to talk, you know. About you. About the dogs." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Am I finally famous?" "In a way," she said with a grin. "Mrs. Kincaid at the post office says you're raising ghost dogs. Henry Blake thinks they're spirit guardians. And the kids at the school, they think you're some kind of wizard." Walter laughed, the sound echoing into the trees. "Well, I do have the beard for it." Jessica smirked. "It's more than that. People need stories, Walter, and yours gives them something to believe in." Indeed, the tale of the reclusive man in the mountains who raised 4 golden retrievers and let them return to the wild had spread throughout Glenwood. It became a story shared at harvest dinners, at the coffee shop downtown, even in the classrooms of Glenwood Elementary, where children would draw crayon sketches of Walter and his forest dogs. At the center of this small myth stood a man who had never sought attention. Walter accepted it with grace, mostly because it brought Jessica around, and because the world had grown quieter without the sound of paws on his porch. One evening, a new face arrived at Walter's cabin. His name was Daniel Reese, a middle-aged journalist with a salt-and-pepper beard, a denim jacket, and a battered leather notebook that never left his hand. He stood about 5'9", slightly stocky, with dark brown eyes that scanned everything and missed nothing. Daniel was a features writer for a regional magazine that specialized in rural stories and quiet legends. He had heard about Walter from Jessica during a forestry seminar. Curious, he'd made the trek up the trail with the intention of writing a piece titled "The Man Who Let Them Go." Walter met him with guarded politeness, offering tea but little more. Daniel was respectful, asking gentle questions, scribbling notes quickly, but never pushing too hard. Over 2 visits, a sort of understanding formed. On his final day, Daniel asked, "Do you regret letting them go?" Walter looked out the window, the setting sun casting orange streaks across the valley. "No," he said quietly, "because they were never mine to begin with." Daniel closed his notebook. That's going to be the title of the article. That winter, the article was published. It included sketches based on old photographs Jessica had taken and a quote from Walter that read, "Some creatures are meant to teach you how to love and then teach you how to let go." The story reached beyond Glenwood. Letters came, some handwritten, others emailed and printed out by Jessica, from strangers who said Walter's words had helped them release something or someone they'd held too tightly. One woman from Nebraska wrote about her son moving away. A man in Oregon shared how reading Walter's story had helped him grieve a dog lost years ago. The quiet man in Pine Valley had without meaning to become a symbol of gentle resilience. One day in early December, Walter sat wrapped in a quilt Jessica had knitted, looking at a sketch Eli Grant had mailed to him, an illustration of the 4 dogs leaping through a golden forest, sunlight catching in their fur. Below it, Eli had written in pencil, "Still watching, still wild." Walter smiled. He still missed them, he always would, but now that missing carried warmth, not ache. He leaned back in his chair, the fire crackling beside him, and whispered, "I hope you're still running." The snow returned to Pine Valley with a quiet vengeance. By late December, the wind swept through the canyon, with icy fingers sculpting drifts along the cabin's windowsills and freezing the creek solid. The pines, once cloaked in vibrant autumn, now stood burdened with white, stoic, and unmoving. Walter Bennett had prepared as he always had, splitting firewood, drying herbs by the hearth, stacking jars of soup in the root cellar. But this year, his hands moved slower, and his breath came shorter with each chore. That night, the cold came harder than forecasted. The thermometer outside his cabin dipped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fire inside burned low. Walter stirred from his rocking chair when he noticed the last log in the fireplace beginning to crumble. He wrapped himself in his thickest coat, a wool number faded to gray over the years, and pulled his hat low over his ears. "I won't be long," he muttered to the empty room, as if someone had been there to listen. Outside, the wind howled between the trees. Walter walked carefully toward the woodpile, cane in one hand and lantern in the other. The snow underfoot was packed but slick, a deceptive surface that gave little warning. As he reached for the logs, his foot caught on a root hidden beneath the snow. His body twisted. The lantern slipped from his grip and shattered, extinguishing in a spray of sparks. Then came the fall. The sound was not dramatic. A dull thud, a sharp crack, bone or ice, he wasn't sure. The world tilted. Pain seared up his side. He tried to move, but something in his hip refused to cooperate. Walter lay there, breath turning to fog, the snow beginning to collect around him. His mind, trained for decades to remember, poems drifted toward panic, but held back. He shouted once, nothing but pine trees and shadows replied. He was too far from town, and even Jessica wasn't due back until Friday. It was Wednesday night. He blinked up at the sky stars, sharp and cold above him, then whispered names into the dark. Sunny, Rusty, Daisy, Maple. They were names he hadn't said aloud in months. His voice cracked as he repeated them, not with hope, but as a final prayer. He did not believe in magic, but he believed in the forest. And once the forest had brought him 4 golden-hearted companions. Miles away in the thickets near Red Fern Hollow, something stirred. 4 shadows moved in near-perfect silence, weaving through the trees. Sunny, now fully grown, with a noble stride, paused mid-step. His ears twitched. Rusty, ever restless, sniffed the wind and barked once sharp and brief. Daisy whined. Maple looked back at them, all then bolted west without hesitation. They had been wandering freely for almost a year, living off the land, but never truly wild. Instinct brought them together. Memory gave them direction. At the edge of Glenwood, Jessica Moore sat by her apartment window, rereading a letter from a childhood friend when her phone rang. It was old Mr. Harlow, a retired trucker, and now the unofficial trail watcher for Pine Ridge. "Jess," his voice crackled, "I just saw something strange on the Lower Ridge Trail. 4 golden dogs moving together like a unit, heading fast uphill. Looked like they were tracking something." Jessica stood. "Where?" west of Dead Man's Curve, heading toward the Bennett place. Her coat was on before he finished the sentence. An hour later, Jessica hiked through the forest with her flashlight slicing through the dark. The snow had begun falling again. As she reached the edge of Walter's clearing, her heart sank. The cabin was dark. Then from the woods near the shed, she heard barking. Urgent, desperate. She ran. There, half buried in snow, was Walter, barely conscious, his lips blue and skin ashen. Around him were 4 golden forms pawing, nudging, digging. Rusty barked until she reached them. Daisy lay curled beside Walter's chest, trying to share her warmth. Sunny stood between Walter and the wind, acting as a windbreak. Maple's tail wagged just once at Jessica before returning her nose to Walter's hand. "Oh my God," Jessica breathed. She dropped beside him, checked his pulse, and radioed for help. Back in Glenwood, the rescue team assembled swiftly. The town's only EMT, Rachel Sims, a stocky woman in her 40s with short red hair and thick gloves, rode with Jessica in the back of the snowmobile. Rachel had known Walter in passing and respected him silently for years. She worked fast, administering warm IV fluids and checking for fractures. "He's lucky," Rachel muttered. "Another hour and we'd be calling the coroner." They transported Walter to the clinic, but not before Jessica turned to the dogs. "I don't know how you knew," she whispered, brushing snow from Daisy's ears. "But thank you." The dogs didn't stay. As soon as Walter was safe, they slipped back into the trees, not even waiting for a goodbye. In the days that followed, Walter slowly recovered in the small clinic. Jessica visited every morning, bringing strong tea and updates from the forest. "You're a hard man to kill," she told him with a smile one morning. Walter grinned weakly. Didn't have much say in the matter. "I called out, and they came." He paused, eyes distant. "They came back, Jess, just like they promised." Jessica didn't ask how he knew. Some truths didn't need proof, they just needed witness. The storm had rolled in with little warning. One moment, Pine Valley lay under calm gray skies, and the next, a white veil descended, turning paths to memory and landmarks into ghosts. The wind howled like a warning from the mountains, and by dusk, Glenwood had hunkered down under layers of snow and silence. Jessica Moore had just finished reviewing her final trail reports when she looked up from her desk. The window was fogged over the trees outside, half lost in the flurry. She sighed, stood, and reached for her jacket. She had planned to visit Walter again in the morning, to check on how the new insulation in his cabin was holding up. But tonight something itched at the back of her mind, a weight she couldn't name. Then the knock came, not at the door, but at the back porch. Not a hand, but a paw. Jessica opened the door and found herself face to face with Daisy. Her coat was matted with snow, her eyes wide with urgency. She barked once short and sharp and turned back toward the trail. Jessica's heart stopped. The golden retrievers hadn't been seen in over a year, not truly. There had been sightings, rumors, prints in mud. But now here one was, not just returned, but trying to lead her somewhere. Without a word, Jessica grabbed her flashlight, radio, and emergency pack. As she locked the station door behind her, she called the Glenwood Volunteer Network. Her voice, usually calm and composed, now carried a tremor. "Search and assist team needed. Follow my signal on Trail 3. This isn't a drill." Within 30 minutes, a small team had assembled. Jessica EMT Kyle Tran, now in his second year of service and still quick-witted even under pressure. Martin Blass, fire chief, with his ever-worn canvas jacket. And Amira Shah, a forest guide in her early 30s, with deep brown skin, tightly braided black hair, and a naturally calm presence that made others feel safe. Amira was relatively new to Pine Valley, having arrived from New Mexico after a personal loss she rarely spoke about. She carried herself with quiet precision and rarely smiled, but when she did, it was sincere. As they gathered at the trailhead, they saw it 4 golden figures against the storm. Sunny stood tall at the front, fur whipped by wind, but eyes steady. Rusty paced behind him, glancing back at the humans as if to say, "Hurry." Maple stood near Daisy, her head low, her breath visible in short puffs. Jessica looked at the team. "We follow them. No questions." The trek through the storm was brutal. The wind clawed at their coats. Snow swallowed their boots. Branches cracked under ice. Yet the dogs moved with certainty, never hesitating, never losing pace. They darted through thick groves, over frozen brooks, and across ledges where visibility was barely 10 feet. Halfway up the slope, Kyle slipped and cut his palm on a jagged rock. Daisy doubled back, pressing against his side for balance. "Thanks," he whispered, stunned by her awareness. Maple nudged his pack forward as if urging him to continue. Then the barking began, loud, insistent, echoing through the trees. Jessica pushed ahead, led by Sonny's voice. They reached a small clearing not marked on any map. There, under a bent pine tree, lay a collapsed tent partially buried in snow. A figure was half visible inside, unmoving. Jessica and Kyle rushed forward, clearing the snow and slicing through the frozen canvas. Inside, curled in a half-conscious heap, was a young woman. Her skin was pale lips, cracked fingers blue at the tips. A broken leg jutted awkwardly beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, but present. Amira quickly assessed the scene, her hands steady despite the cold. Fracture, early hypothermia, dehydrated. "Do we know who she is?" Martin asked. Jessica pulled a laminated photo from the woman's coat. It was a missing hiker alert, a case Jessica had seen circulated briefly, but then dismissed. The woman was Cora Jennings, a 26-year-old wildlife photographer from Oregon, who had gone missing 3 weeks earlier after being presumed to have rerouted south. "She must have tried to shelter during the first snow," Jessica murmured. "No one thought to search this far north." They worked fast. Kyle stabilized her leg, Martin radioed for extraction, and Amira wrapped her in emergency blankets. Throughout the entire process, the 4 dogs remained nearby, circling, watching, and in Daisy's case, even lying beside Cora to provide warmth. As the sled team arrived an hour later, pulled by snowmobiles from town, the rescue team prepared to escort Cora down. "Without them," Jessica said quietly, nodding toward the dogs, "we would never have found her in time." Once Cora was safe and on her way to the Glenwood Clinic, the team turned back to thank the retrievers, but they were already gone. Just like before, Jessica stood still, snow falling silently around her. They come when they're needed, then they return to the trees. The next morning, Glenwood buzzed with the news. At the Timber Spoon Cafe, Mira Delgado taped a photo of the dogs above the register with the words, "Heroes of Pine Valley." The elementary school painted new murals, and the townspeople, even those who once dismissed the legend, now spoke with reverence of the pact. Walter, now stronger and recovering at home, listened to the tale from Jessica as she poured him tea. "They came back again," she said softly. Walter smiled without surprise. Of course they did. That was the promise. He sipped his tea, then reached down to pet Daisy, who had returned to him the following night, curling beside his chair as if she had never left. In the weeks that followed, Walter Bennett's rescue, Glenwood transformed not only in its winter appearance, but in its spirit. The story of the 4 golden retrievers who saved their former companion swept through the town like fire across dry pine. Newspapers picked it up, followed by a few radio interviews and even a call from a Denver TV crew. But to Walter, resting quietly in the small Glenwood Clinic, it wasn't about publicity. It was about the warmth he still felt, not just from the dog's return, but from the people whose lives had quietly converged around his. Walter had survived hypothermia and a fractured hip. He remained pale and weak, the lines on his face now deeper with exhaustion, but his eyes still glimmered behind his glasses. His room, simple and sunlit, often smelled of pine needles and tea. Jessica visited daily, her hair often tucked beneath a knit beanie, her cheeks flushed from the cold. One afternoon, as she adjusted the pillows behind him, Walter asked, "Did they stay?" Jessica smiled softly. "Only long enough to see you were safe. Then they disappeared back into the trees." Walter nodded, eyes misting. "That's just like them. Come when you need them, vanish when you don't." Outside the clinic, a small movement had begun, one that started with Jessica and quietly grew. She had begun talking to people one by one about Walter's cabin, about how it had sheltered not only him, but the dogs who had become legends in the valley. She believed it deserved more than to fall to mold and wind. It started at the Timber Spoon, Glenwood's only cafe run by Mira Delgado, a curvy woman in her late 50s with thick salt and pepper curls and an apron always dusted with flour. Mira had always liked Walter even if he rarely visited. When Jessica spoke to her about a fundraiser, Mira didn't hesitate. "We'll host a bake sale," Mira said, tying her apron tighter. "All proceeds go to Walter's rebuild." From there, the idea blossomed. At Rusty's Hardware, owned by red-bearded, quiet-spoken Tom Bell, lumber was donated. Glenwood High School's art club, led by a tall, thin teacher named Mrs. Addison Lake, offered to paint a mural on one of Walter's cabin walls. The mural would depict the 4 dogs watching over the woods, guardians of Pine Valley. Even the mayor, a balding, always sweating man named Robert Kane, signed off on a permit to allow town volunteers to assist with cabin repairs on protected forest land. Each weekend, townspeople braved the snow to haul supplies, repair roofing, clear pathways, and repaint the faded logs of Walter's home. Children drew paw prints in the snow beside the path leading to the porch. An old man named Francis Reeve, who once did carpentry for a living, and now walked with two canes, insisted on sanding the new front door by hand. Jessica coordinated it all. She slept little, worked often, and refused credit. But behind every delivery, every donation, her name was whispered, like a quiet thank you. Back at the clinic, Walter improved day by day. He was learning to use a walker, though he hated the thing. He preferred sitting by the window, watching the light dance across the mountain ridges, reading poetry aloud to anyone who would listen. One snowy morning, Rachel Sims, the town EMT who had helped save his life, came to change his bandages. She was dressed in her usual maroon scrubs, her hair pulled into a practical bun. "You've got a fan club now, she said, while wrapping his leg. "Never seen the town rally like this before." Walter chuckled. "All I did was fall in the snow." Rachel looked at him knowingly. "No, sir. You built something people believe in. That's rarer than you think." When Walter was finally discharged, a small crowd awaited him outside. Jessica had brought his old coat cleaned and mended, and wrapped a scarf around his neck. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Walter looked up toward the road where the truck waited. "I suppose I'd better see what all this fuss is about." When he arrived at the cabin, he was speechless. The entire front facade had been restored. The sagging roof was now reinforced, the windows replaced with new glass that reflected the trees. A wooden sign hung above the porch, carved carefully by hand. It read, "The Golden Hearth." Inside, his old chair had been reupholstered. New shelves lined the walls already filled with books. A rug covered the floor where the dogs used to curl up. And by the fire, a new portrait hung, a painting of Sunny Rusty Daisy and Maple standing at the tree line, light pouring from behind them. Walter blinked rapidly. "Who did all this?" Jessica stepped forward. "Everyone. For everything you gave without asking for a thing back." Walter sat down slowly, letting the warmth seep into his skin. "I don't deserve this." "No," she said, sitting beside him. "You earned it." That evening, the fire crackled softly, and Walter dozed in his chair, wrapped in a quilt the townspeople had stitched together from donated scraps. On his lap lay a notebook filled with letters from strangers across the state, each one thanking him for reminding them of something they'd forgotten, that love doesn't vanish. It simply waits in the trees. Spring returned to Pine Valley with its usual grace, and with it came a kind of warmth that was more than weather. It was the kind that settled into walls, soaked into wooden floorboards, and hung quietly in the laughter of those who visited. Walter Bennett's cabin, now known throughout town as the Golden Hearth, no longer stood merely as a structure in the woods. It had become a story, etched in bark and memory. Walter, slower than before, but still sharp, spent his days by the window, or on the front porch wrapped in the quilt stitched by neighbors. A cane rested by his side, though he used it less now. He wore his age like an old flannel, worn in places but deeply familiar. His beard had grown fuller, almost snowy white, and his eyes retained that glint of calm mischief he'd always had. He read poetry again, sometimes aloud, sometimes just mouthing the words as birds fluttered past the porch. And then one morning, the quiet was broken by 4 sets of paws pattering over soft earth. Sonny arrived first, emerging from the trees like a golden beacon. He looked stronger than ever, his thick coat dusted with pine needles, his steps steady and unhurried. Rusty followed, bounding forward with his signature lopsided ear and a tongue that still lolled crookedly out the side of his mouth. Daisy came next, more graceful than before, her gait light, her gaze tender. Maple was last, silent and solemn, as always, her pale fur gleaming in the rising sun. Walter was pouring his tea when he saw them. The cup trembled slightly in his hand. "Well," he whispered, the voice catching your home. They didn't bark. They didn't rush. They walked up the steps as if they had never left and laid down at his feet like chapters returning to a book. Jessica arrived minutes later, a basket of scones in hand. She froze at the sight of the dogs, then smiled so widely it made her eyes brim with tears. "They came back," she said. Walter didn't look away from them. They were always meant to. That afternoon, news of the dogs' return spread like pollen in wind. Children rode bikes to the edge of the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse. Mira Delgado from the cafe brought a jar of bacon treats. Tom Bell came with a new nameplate for the porch steps, home of the Golden Pact. The town couldn't quite explain it. The dogs had been gone wild unseen for nearly a year, except in those fateful moments when they had saved Walter and led the rescue of Eli Grant. Their return now after everything was not just improbable, it was something else entirely. Some said it was nature's way of keeping promises. Others simply called it magic. Walter didn't care what they called it. He called it family. The dogs fell back into routine quickly. Sonny resumed his post by the front door, ever watchful. Rusty wandered the edges of the property, chasing squirrels and pretending to be a guard dog. Daisy curled by Walter's chair, as he read, occasionally resting her head on his knee. Maple followed Jessica everywhere whenever she visited, tail barely wagging, but eyes locked in gentle devotion. One day, a group of students from Glenwood Elementary, led by Mrs. Addison Lake, visited the cabin. They brought a banner painted in watercolor, "Thank you, Golden Hearts." Each child had drawn one of the dogs with exaggerated tails and happy eyes. Walter welcomed them with warm cider and recited Robert Frost's "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." The dogs lay at his feet, unmoving, serene. Later that week, Hannah Quill, the diner owner, proposed an annual tradition, the Golden Pact Festival. Every spring, townspeople would hike to Walter's cabin, share food, read poetry, and celebrate loyalty in all its forms. The mayor approved it without hesitation. Walter's final years became something few people in small towns ever truly experience, a living legend surrounded by those who believed in it. His days were filled with quiet rituals, reading tea, brushing the dogs, writing letters he never mailed. He kept a journal titled simply, "Them," filled with memories of the day he first found the pups in the snow and all the days that followed. When he eventually passed, it was peaceful. He was in his chair by the fire, sunlight streaming across his lap, a dog at each side. His eyes were closed. He had been reading when the last breath came. It was Jessica who found him. She didn't cry immediately. She simply sat beside him for a while, resting her hand on Daisy's head. The funeral was small, just as Walter would have wanted, but the people who mattered came: Jessica Mira, Tom, Rachel Martin, and a dozen more. Children brought flowers. The dog stood quietly by the casket, unmoving until the end. A stone was placed at the cabin's edge beneath the pines, where the wind always whispered. It read, "Walter Bennett, teacher-keeper of Golden Hearts, friend of the wild. They came when he needed them. They stayed when he deserved them." And the cabin remained. Maintained by the town, visited by travelers, protected by the ridge, and on certain quiet mornings, still surrounded by 4 golden figures who watched the forest and waited for the next story to find them. Sometimes God's quietest miracles arrive not in lightning or noise, but in warmth and loyalty, in the silent return of something you thought was lost forever. Walter's story reminds us that love never truly disappears. It lingers, it listens, and at the right moment it finds its way back, just like grace gently placed by the hands of the Lord. In our everyday lives, we all face seasons of silence, of waiting, of wondering if anyone remembers. But perhaps like Walter, we are not forgotten. We are being watched over in ways we cannot yet see. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs a sign of hope today. Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the hidden kindness still alive in the world. Comment amen if you believe that love, loyalty, and God's timing are never too late. May God bless and guide every soul who watches this.